Picture this. You're sitting in the outdoor courtyard of an elite prep school, quietly eating your homemade lunch when the most popular guy in school decides to accidentally knock a handful of earthworms from the science composting project directly into your sandwich. Most students would be mortified, disgusted, maybe throw the food away and go hungry. But what these bullies didn't know was that Emma Chen wasn't most students. She was a third-degree black belt in taekwondo, with reflexes trained since childhood, and a father who'd taught her that backing down from a fight only invited more violence. What happened next became the most legendary 60 seconds in Riverside Preparatory Institute's 40-year history. Blake Morrison thought he was about to humiliate the quiet scholarship girl into complete social exile. Instead, he was about to discover why you should never mess with someone whose morning routine includes breaking boards with her bare feet, and whose idea of stress relief involves perfecting spinning kicks that can generate over 800 pounds of force per square inch. This is that story. The day a privileged bully learned that money and connections mean nothing when you target someone who's been weaponizing her body since she could walk. The day Emma Chen stopped hiding who she really was and showed an entire school what happens when you force someone trained in combat to defend their dignity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist rolled off the Columbia River like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the modern glass and timber buildings of Riverside Preparatory Institute. Emma Chen pressed her face against the cool window of the city bus, watching her new world emerge from the Pacific Northwest fog in muted greens and grays. 2 months into her junior year at her 7th school in 10 years, and she still felt like an observer studying an alien civilization through protective glass. The bus wheezed to a stop at the institute's sleek metal gates, and Emma shouldered her worn backpack while checking that her lunch was secure in its compartment. She'd learned long ago that bringing food from home was both a financial necessity and a cultural marker that separated her from classmates whose parents thought nothing of giving them $20 bills for cafeteria meals that cost more than her family spent on groceries for 3 days. Riverside Preparatory Institute stretched before her like a monument to tech money and Pacific Northwest environmental consciousness. The main building's walls were floor-to-ceiling windows interrupted by sustainably harvested timber beams, designed to blur the line between indoor learning and outdoor nature. Students moved through the covered walkways with the casual confidence of people who'd never questioned whether they belonged anywhere, their conversations flowing with references to weekend ski trips to Mount Hood and summer internships at companies their parents owned or invested in. Emma pulled her forest green cardigan tighter around her shoulders, not against the cool October air, but as psychological armor against the invisible barriers she encountered daily. Her scholarship to Riverside had come through a combination of academic excellence and her father's military service, opening doors to opportunities her family could never have afforded. But scholarship students were like exotic animals in a zoo here, simultaneously welcomed for the diversity they represented and isolated by the economic realities that separated their experiences from those of their classmates. Colonel David Chen was currently stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord, preparing for another deployment that would take him away from his family for 8 months. Emma's mother, Dr. Sarah Chen, worked grueling shifts at Riverside General Hospital, often pulling double shifts to cover the mortgage on their small apartment above Master Kim's Taekwondo Academy. The arrangement was practical, providing affordable housing in exchange for Emma helping with children's classes, but it also meant she lived literally above the dojo where she'd spent every morning since age 6, perfecting techniques that most of her classmates had never heard of. Emma had researched Riverside Preparatory thoroughly before arriving, as was her habit when facing any new environment. Academic rankings, college placement statistics, student demographics, and most importantly, the social ecosystem that could determine whether a transfer student thrived or merely survived. The school's glossy promotional materials emphasized inclusivity and academic excellence, but the anonymous student discussion boards revealed a different reality. Like every elite institution, Riverside had its unspoken hierarchies and untouchable students. At the center of that social constellation was Blake Morrison, and Emma had made it her business to understand exactly what kind of person she was dealing with. Student body president, captain of the lacrosse team, son of Morrison Tech Solutions founder, and according to multiple online sources, someone who treated the school's social environment like his personal kingdom, where his word carried the weight of law. The warnings she'd found were consistent across multiple platforms. Blake didn't just ignore students he considered beneath his notice. He actively worked to make their lives difficult if they showed any sign of challenging the established order. His methods were sophisticated, ranging from social media manipulation to academic sabotage, always executed with enough plausible deniability to avoid official consequences while ensuring maximum psychological impact on his targets. Emma had no intention of challenging anything. Her strategy was simple: maintain perfect grades, avoid unnecessary social interaction, and graduate in 18 months, with the kind of transcript that would earn her a full scholarship to a university far from Oregon, where nobody would know about her family's financial struggles or her father's upcoming deployment to Afghanistan. All she had to do was remain invisible until then. The main hallway buzzed with pre-class energy as students who'd known each other since elementary school exchanged updates about weekend adventures that cost more than Emma's family spent on entertainment in a year. She navigated toward her locker, tucked in a quieter alcove near the library where foot traffic was lighter and observation was less likely. As she worked the combination lock, Emma became aware of a shift in the hallway's atmosphere, a subtle change in conversational volume and body language that indicated the arrival of someone significant. Blake Morrison commanded attention without effort, moving through the corridor with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never experienced genuine consequences for his actions. Even from a distance, Emma could see why he dominated Riverside's social landscape. Tall and athletically built with perfectly styled brown hair and the kind of casual, expensive clothing that screamed old money, Blake possessed the natural charisma that came from a lifetime of having every door opened for him. His usual entourage of athletes and social climbers orbited around him like planets around the sun, their conversations punctuated by laughter that sounded forced and desperate for his approval. Emma finished organizing her textbooks and closed her locker, hoping to slip away before Blake's attention turned in her direction. But as she'd learned at 6 previous schools, hoping to avoid notice and actually achieving invisibility were two very different things. The October morning carried the scent of rain and cedar as Emma made her way through Riverside Preparatory's covered walkways toward her first period chemistry class. The architecture itself seemed designed to remind students of their privilege, with soaring ceilings that showcased handcrafted timber beams and walls of glass that offered panoramic views of the Columbia River Valley. Everything about the environment whispered expensive taste and environmental consciousness, the kind of place where sustainability meant installing solar panels that cost more than most families earned in a year. Emma had spent her first weeks at Riverside studying the social geography with the same methodical attention her father applied to military intelligence gathering. The student body divided into distinct territories as clearly marked as any battlefield, though the boundaries were invisible to casual observation. The main courtyard belonged to the athletes and student government types, their conversations dominated by college recruitment visits and family connections to admissions departments. The library's reading nooks were claimed by academic overachievers whose parents expected nothing less than acceptance to Stanford or MIT. The art building attracted the creative types, mostly students whose trust funds allowed them to pursue passion projects without worrying about practical career considerations. Then there were students like Emma, scholarship recipients and middle-class kids whose families had stretched financially to afford Riverside's tuition. They existed in the spaces between territories, welcome nowhere and belonging nowhere, tolerated as necessary additions to the school's diversity statistics but never truly accepted into the social fabric that bound their wealthier classmates together. The chemistry classroom occupied the top floor of the science building, its windows overlooking the school's organic garden and composting facility that served as both educational tool and symbol of Riverside's commitment to environmental stewardship. Emma chose a seat in the back corner, arranging her materials while listening to the casual conversations that revealed so much about her classmates' assumptions and expectations. "Did you see Blake's Instagram from this weekend?" The voice belonged to Madison Parker, whose family owned a chain of boutique hotels throughout the Pacific Northwest. Madison possessed the kind of effortless beauty that came from generations of good genetics and expensive skincare, her blonde hair always perfectly styled despite Oregon's persistent humidity. "His family's new yacht is incredible. Apparently it has a helicopter landing pad." "Of course it does," replied Ashley Kim, daughter of a tech executive whose company had been acquired by Google for several $billion. "The Morrisons don't do anything halfway." Did you know Blake's already been accepted to Stanford? Early admission, and his dad donated an entire computer lab to the business school. Emma filed this information away while pretending to focus on her chemistry notes. Blake Morrison wasn't just popular because of his charisma or athletic ability. His family's wealth provided him with opportunities and security that made failure virtually impossible. When someone possessed that level of advantage, they developed a particular kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about consequences. They could afford to take risks because they knew their safety net was woven from money and connections that could fix almost any problem. The door opened, and Blake himself entered the classroom with the casual lateness of someone who knew rules didn't really apply to him. He wore his uniform with deliberate imperfection, his tie slightly loosened and his blazer unbuttoned in a way that suggested rebellion within acceptable parameters. Several students straightened in their seats as he passed, their body language unconsciously deferential to his presence. "Sorry I'm late, Mrs. Patterson," Blake said with a smile that managed to be both apologetic and completely unapologetic. Student council meeting ran long. You know how it is when you're trying to plan the winter formal. Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s who'd been teaching at Riverside for over a decade, simply nodded and gestured for him to take a seat. Emma had noticed this pattern before. Teachers at elite schools developed a particular tolerance for the minor infractions of students whose families appeared on the donor recognition plaques in the main hallway. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It wasn't corruption exactly, but rather a practical acknowledgement of the economic realities that kept private schools operating. Blake chose a seat in the middle of the classroom, his usual position that allowed him to be the center of attention without appearing to seek it. His presence immediately shifted the room's energy, with conversations becoming slightly louder and more performative as students unconsciously competed for his notice. Emma had seen this dynamic before at other schools, though rarely with such intensity. Blake Morrison commanded social gravity in a way that pulled everyone into his orbit whether they wanted to be there or not. As Mrs. Patterson began her lesson on molecular bonding, Emma found herself studying Blake's interaction patterns with scientific curiosity. He participated just enough to appear engaged without actually exerting effort, his responses revealing someone who was genuinely intelligent but had never been forced to work hard for academic success. When called upon, he answered with the casual confidence of someone who knew that even if he was wrong, there would be no meaningful consequences. More revealing were his interactions with different types of students. With fellow athletes and wealthy classmates, Blake was charming and inclusive, his body language open and his attention generous. With scholarship students or those from less prominent families, his demeanor shifted subtly but unmistakably. His responses became shorter, his eye contact briefer, his overall energy conveying polite disinterest rather than genuine engagement. It was a masterclass in social stratification, disguised as natural charisma. Emma had encountered this behavior pattern before, though never from someone with Blake's level of institutional protection. At public schools and military bases, bullies typically relied on physical intimidation or crude verbal harassment, tactics that could be documented and reported to authorities who were required to respond. But at places like Riverside, the methods were more sophisticated. Social exclusion, academic sabotage, digital harassment campaigns executed through networks of followers who worshipped wealth and status above basic human decency. The bell announcing the end of first period rang with an electronic chime that echoed through the glass-walled corridors. Students gathered their materials with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to moving between scheduled activities, their conversations already shifting to upcoming classes and afternoon plans that required significant disposable income to execute. Emma packed her chemistry textbook while observing the social dynamics playing out around her. Blake held court near the whiteboard, surrounded by students eager to bask in his attention and approval. Madison Parker touched his arm while speaking, her body language advertising a relationship that was equal parts romantic and strategic alliance between powerful families. Connor Walsh, Blake's closest friend and co-captain of the lacrosse team, provided muscle and intimidation when Blake's charisma proved insufficient to achieve his goals. As Emma moved toward the door, she noticed Blake's attention turn in her direction for the first time since her arrival at Riverside. His gaze was analytical rather than friendly, the look of someone cataloging potential threats or opportunities. Their eyes met for just a moment before Emma looked away, but that brief contact was enough to confirm what she'd suspected since her first day at the school. Blake Morrison had noticed her, and in her experience, that kind of attention from someone with his resources and temperament never led anywhere good. She would need to be even more careful about maintaining her invisibility, because students like Blake didn't tolerate anything that challenged their perception of the natural order. Emma Chen represented everything Blake's worldview couldn't accommodate: genuine merit without inherited privilege, discipline earned through sacrifice rather than purchased through family connections, and most dangerously, the suggestion that his advantages might not make him inherently superior to everyone around him. Dawn broke over Riverside with the soft gray light that characterized Pacific Northwest mornings, filtering through the tall windows of Master Kim's Taekwondo Academy as Emma completed her daily training ritual. The dojo occupied the ground floor of the converted warehouse that housed her family's apartment, its polished wooden floors bearing the scuff marks of countless students who had learned to transform their bodies into weapons through years of disciplined practice. Emma moved through her forms with the fluid precision of someone for whom martial arts had become as natural as breathing. Her morning routine began at 5:30, an hour before even the most dedicated athletes at Riverside had considered leaving their beds, and consisted of warm-up exercises that would have challenged college-level competitors. She flowed seamlessly from basic techniques to advanced combinations, her body remembering movements that had been drilled into muscle memory through 10 years of consistent training. Master Kim observed from his position near the heavy bags, his weathered face impassive as he watched his most accomplished student practice techniques that had taken her years to master. Kim Sung-ho had immigrated to Oregon 25 years earlier, with nothing but his knowledge of traditional Korean martial arts, and an unshakable belief that discipline could transform any willing student into something extraordinary. He had trained hundreds of children over the decades, but Emma Chen possessed something rare: the combination of natural ability, intellectual curiosity, and emotional control that separated true martial artists from students who simply learned to kick and punch. The relationship between teacher and student had evolved far beyond the typical instructor-pupil dynamic. When Emma's family had needed affordable housing near Riverside Preparatory, Master Kim had offered them the apartment above his academy in exchange for Emma helping with children's classes and maintaining the dojo's equipment. It was an arrangement that benefited everyone involved, providing the Chen family with a home they could afford while giving Master Kim an assistant instructor whose technical skills exceeded those of many black belts twice her age. Emma finished her forms and moved to the heavy bag, beginning a striking sequence that showcased the explosive power hidden beneath her quiet exterior. Her spinning heel kick, executed with perfect technique and devastating force, would have impressed professional fighters. The technique required precise timing, exceptional balance, and the ability to generate rotational momentum through the entire body, while maintaining enough control to strike exactly where intended. Master Kim had spent 2 years teaching her to perform the movement correctly, and another 3 helping her develop the power to make it genuinely dangerous. "Your father called last night," Master Kim said as Emma toweled off after completing her workout. His English carried the formal precision of someone who had learned the language as an adult, but spoke it with careful attention to grammar and pronunciation. "His deployment date has been moved forward by 2 weeks. He will be leaving for Afghanistan sooner than expected." Emma absorbed this information without visible reaction, though Master Kim's trained eye caught the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated emotional stress. Colonel David Chen's military career had shaped every aspect of his daughter's upbringing, from their frequent relocations to his insistence that she develop skills that would serve her regardless of where life took their family. Taekwondo had been his suggestion when Emma was 6 years old, not because he expected her to become a fighter, but because he understood that confidence and self-discipline were weapons that no one could take away from her. "How is your mother handling the news?" Master Kim asked, his tone gentle but direct. He had developed genuine affection for the Chen family during their months living above his academy. Watching Emma balance her academic excellence with her responsibilities as an assistant instructor, while her mother worked exhausting shifts at the hospital to support their household. "She's concerned about managing everything alone while he's deployed," Emma replied, beginning to wrap her hands with the methodical care of someone who understood the importance of protecting her weapons. "The hospital has been understaffed, and she's been pulling doubles 3 times a week." "Dad's worried about leaving us without his income for 8 months, especially with my tuition at Riverside." Master Kim nodded thoughtfully. The financial pressures facing military families were something he understood intimately, having built his academy specifically to serve students whose families struggled with the cost of traditional martial arts training. Emma's scholarship to Riverside represented an extraordinary opportunity, but it also came with social and emotional costs that her parents hadn't fully anticipated when they'd moved to Oregon. "At your previous schools, how did you handle students who tried to make you feel unwelcome?" Master Kim asked, his question seemingly casual but loaded with deeper meaning. He had noticed changes in Emma's demeanor over the past few weeks, subtle signs of stress that suggested her transition to Riverside was proving more challenging than expected. Emma paused in her rapping, considering how much to reveal about her growing concerns regarding Blake Morrison and the social dynamics at her new school. "I kept my head down and focused on academics. Military kids learn to adapt quickly because we know we'll be moving again soon. But Riverside feels different. The students there have never had to question whether they belong anywhere, and they don't react well to anything that challenges their assumptions about social order." "And you challenge their assumptions simply by existing," Master Kim observed. "A scholarship student who earns perfect grades without wealthy parents to hire tutors. A quiet girl who doesn't seek their approval or acceptance. Someone whose confidence comes from within rather than from external validation. Such a person represents everything they fear about merit versus inherited privilege." Emma smiled grimly at her teacher's accurate assessment. Master Kim possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that made him an exceptional instructor, able to read his students' emotional states and provide guidance that extended far beyond physical techniques. He had taught her that true martial arts training was as much about mental discipline as physical skill, developing the kind of inner strength that allowed someone to remain calm under pressure and make rational decisions when others would panic. "The boy who leads their social hierarchy has begun to notice me," Emma said carefully. "Blake Morrison. His family basically owns this town, and he's accustomed to everyone either worshiping him or staying out of his way. I think he's trying to decide which category I belong in." Master Kim's expression grew serious. He had encountered Blake Morrison's type before, wealthy young men who viewed the world as their personal playground and other people as objects to be manipulated for their entertainment. Such individuals could be genuinely dangerous when they felt their authority challenged, especially when they possessed the resources and connections to avoid consequences for their actions. "What does your training tell you about dealing with such a person?" Master Kim asked. Emma considered the question while finishing her hand wraps. "Avoidance is the preferred strategy. Don't engage. Don't give him reasons to focus on me. Graduate and move on with my life. But if avoidance becomes impossible, respond with overwhelming superiority and decisive action. Dad always said that showing weakness to a predator only makes them more aggressive. Your father is wise, but remember that true strength sometimes means choosing not to fight. Even when you possess the ability to win, the most dangerous opponent is one who has nothing left to lose, and wealthy bullies often become desperate when their usual tactics prove ineffective against someone like you." Emma nodded, understanding the deeper wisdom in her teacher's words. Master Kim had survived poverty, immigration, and decades of building a business in a culture that often dismissed Asian martial arts as inferior to Western fighting systems. He had learned when to fight, when to retreat, and when to wait for exactly the right moment to demonstrate his capabilities. As Emma prepared to leave for school, Master Kim offered one final piece of advice. "Remember that your training extends beyond physical techniques. You have been taught to observe, to analyze, to remain calm under pressure, and to make strategic decisions based on logic rather than emotion. These skills are your greatest weapons, not your ability to break boards or execute spinning kicks. Use them wisely." Emma gathered her school bag and headed toward the bus stop, her morning training session having centered her mind and prepared her body for whatever challenges the day might bring. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of, even if she hoped never to need those capabilities. Her classmates at Riverside saw a quiet scholarship student who kept to herself and earned perfect grades through hard work. They had no idea they were sharing their hallways with someone who could disable a grown man in seconds if the situation demanded it. The morning mist was lifting from the Columbia River as Emma's bus wound through the expensive neighborhoods surrounding Riverside Preparatory, carrying her toward another day of careful invisibility In a world where her presence challenged everything her classmates believed about merit, privilege, and the natural order of their carefully constructed social universe. The Morrison family estate sprawled across 15 acres of prime waterfront property overlooking the Columbia River, its contemporary architecture, a testament to the kind of wealth that shaped entire communities through economic influence rather than ostentatious display. Blake Morrison had grown up in this environment of casual power, where dinner conversations involved deciding which politicians to support, and weekend activities included helicopter flights to the family's vacation properties scattered throughout the Pacific Northwest. Blake's relationship with power was as natural as breathing, developed through 17 years of watching his father navigate board meetings, city council sessions, and charity galas, where seven-figure donations were discussed with the same casual tone most families use to plan grocery shopping. Morrison Tech Solutions employed over 3,000 people across Oregon and Washington, making David Morrison one of the region's most influential business leaders and ensuring that local politicians treated the family's opinions as policy recommendations rather than mere suggestions. The morning routine in the Morrison household reflected this seamless integration of privilege and expectation. Blake's breakfast was prepared by household staff who had worked for the family for over a decade. His school clothes were laid out by a personal assistant who managed his schedule and commitments, and his transportation to Riverside Preparatory was provided by a driver who doubled as personal security when the family traveled. This level of service wasn't considered excessive or unusual. It was simply the infrastructure necessary to support someone whose time was considered too valuable to waste on mundane tasks. Blake's academic performance at Riverside was competent rather than exceptional. But competence was sufficient when your family had endowed the school's technology center and your mother served on the board of trustees. His teachers understood that Blake Morrison was being groomed for leadership roles that would be offered based on his connections rather than earned through pure merit, and they adjusted their expectations accordingly. This wasn't corruption in any traditional sense, but rather a practical acknowledgement of how elite institutions actually functioned when significant financial interests were involved. What made Blake genuinely dangerous wasn't his wealth or connections, though those provided considerable protection from consequences. His true weapon was an intuitive understanding of social psychology that allowed him to identify and exploit other people's insecurities with surgical precision. Blake had spent his teenage years studying his classmates the way a predator studies prey, learning which buttons to push to achieve maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. His methods were sophisticated and evolved constantly, based on the target's vulnerabilities and the social environment where the harassment occurred. With academically focused students, Blake would orchestrate situations that made them question their intellectual abilities or spread rumors about academic dishonesty that could damage their college prospects. With students from less wealthy families, he would arrange scenarios that highlighted their economic disadvantages or create situations where they couldn't afford to participate in social activities that defined inclusion at Riverside. The beauty of Blake's approach lay in its subtlety and the willing participation of other students who were eager to maintain their positions in his social hierarchy. His followers didn't see themselves as bullies or enablers. They believed they were part of an exclusive group that maintained standards and traditions at Riverside. When Blake targeted someone for harassment, he framed it as protecting the school's culture from people who didn't understand or appreciate the values that made their community special. Emma had spent considerable time researching Blake's history through careful observation and discreet inquiries among students who seemed willing to talk about Riverside's social dynamics. What she discovered painted a picture of someone whose behavior had escalated steadily over his years at the school, protected by his family's influence and enabled by an administration that preferred to handle problems quietly rather than risk losing major donors. The most revealing incident had occurred during Blake's sophomore year, when a scholarship student named Marcus Williams had challenged Blake's authority during a student government meeting. Marcus had questioned the allocation of funds for social events that primarily benefited wealthy students while ignoring programs that would serve the broader school community. His proposal for need-based assistance with extracurricular activities had gained support from several teachers and a surprising number of students who appreciated the idea of making Riverside more inclusive. Blake's response had been swift and comprehensive. Within a week, rumors began circulating about Marcus's academic integrity, supported by carefully fabricated evidence that suggested he had plagiarized several assignments. Anonymous social media accounts began posting content that highlighted Marcus's scholarship status and his family's financial struggles, framing him as someone who was taking opportunities away from more deserving students. The harassment escalated to include his family members, with his mother receiving phone calls at work, questioning her son's behavior and suggesting that perhaps Riverside wasn't the right environment for their family. The campaign continued for 3 months, growing more sophisticated and vicious over time. Marcus's grades suffered as he struggled to focus on academics while dealing with constant harassment. His social isolation became complete, as other students distanced themselves to avoid becoming targets themselves. Finally, his family made the decision to transfer him to a public school, unable to afford the emotional and financial costs of fighting a system that seemed designed to protect students like Blake Morrison, while sacrificing anyone who challenged their authority. What made the Marcus Williams incident particularly instructive was how effectively Blake had managed to avoid any official consequences while destroying another student's life at Riverside. The evidence of plagiarism was eventually proven false, but only after Marcus had already transferred. The harassment campaign was attributed to unknown social media accounts that couldn't be traced back to specific individuals. Blake's role in orchestrating the entire operation remained officially unproven, though everyone involved understood exactly who was responsible and why. Emma had learned about Marcus Williams through careful conversations with Sophie Martinez, one of the few students at Riverside who seemed genuinely troubled by the toxic social dynamics that Blake's influence had created. Sophie was dating Jake Thompson, a junior on the lacrosse team who had witnessed Blake's behind-the-scenes coordination of harassment campaigns against students he considered threats to his authority. Jake's loyalty to Blake was complicated by his growing discomfort with methods that went far beyond typical teenage social politics into territory that felt genuinely cruel and potentially criminal. Sophie had warned Emma during a chance encounter in the library, speaking in hushed tones while pretending to study for their shared advanced placement literature class. The conversation had been brief and coded, but the message was clear. Blake Morrison had noticed Emma Chen, and students who caught his attention rarely remained unscathed if they failed to demonstrate appropriate deference to his position at the top of Riverside's social hierarchy. The warning had come with specific details about Blake's preferred tactics and the resources he could deploy when targeting someone for systematic harassment. His family's wealth provided access to private investigators who could dig up embarrassing information about targets and their families. His mother's position on the school board ensured that complaints about his behavior would be handled discreetly and without meaningful consequences. Most importantly, his network of followers at Riverside included students whose families controlled local media outlets, ensuring that any negative publicity about Blake or his activities would be suppressed or reframed to protect his reputation. Emma had thanked Sophie for the information, while maintaining her facade of quiet scholarship student who simply wanted to focus on academics and avoid drama. But internally, she was cataloging every detail about Blake's methods and resources, analyzing his psychological profile with the same systematic approach her father used when studying enemy combatants in military contexts. Blake Morrison might have the advantages of wealth and social position, but Emma possessed something he had never encountered: genuine training in strategic thinking and psychological warfare from someone who had spent 20 years fighting actual enemies rather than helpless teenagers. The challenge would be maintaining her invisibility long enough to complete her education at Riverside, without giving Blake sufficient provocation to unleash his full arsenal of harassment techniques. Emma understood that she represented everything Blake's worldview couldn't accommodate, and that eventually their paths would cross in ways that couldn't be avoided through careful planning and social camouflage. When that moment arrived, she intended to be ready. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant rain as students gathered in Riverside Preparatory's outdoor courtyard for lunch, their voices creating a constant hum of conversation that echoed off the glass walls of the surrounding buildings. Emma Chen sat alone at her usual table near the edge of the covered dining area, methodically unpacking the lunch her mother had prepared before leaving for her morning shift at the hospital. The meal was simple but nutritious: a turkey sandwich on whole wheat bread, an apple, a small container of homemade soup, and a thermos of green tea that would help her maintain focus through her afternoon classes. The courtyard buzzed with the energy of students who had known each other since elementary school, their conversations flowing seamlessly between weekend plans that required significant disposable income and college applications that assumed acceptance to prestigious universities was simply a matter of choosing which family connections to leverage. Emma had learned to tune out most of the background chatter, but her situational awareness remained sharp enough to notice subtle changes in the social atmosphere that might signal approaching trouble. She was reviewing notes for her advanced placement literature exam when she became aware that the conversational volume around her had dropped significantly, replaced by the kind of anticipatory silence that preceded either entertainment or violence. Emma looked up from her textbook to find Blake Morrison approaching her table with his usual entourage, his expression carrying the kind of predatory focus that suggested he had finally decided to address her presence at Riverside in ways that couldn't be ignored or deflected. Blake moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose, his school blazer worn with deliberate imperfection, and his sandy brown hair styled in the expensive casual way that required significant maintenance to appear effortless. Behind him, Connor Walsh and Madison Parker flanked his movement like bodyguards, their body language aggressive and territorial in ways that made other students unconsciously clear a path for their approach. "Emma Chen," Blake said as he reached her table, his voice pitched to carry to the surrounding students who had stopped their own conversations to observe the interaction. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. Blake Morrison, student body president and captain of the lacrosse team. I've been meaning to welcome you to our little community here at Riverside." Emma set down her sandwich and looked up at Blake with the neutral expression she had perfected over years of dealing with authority figures who commanded respect through position, rather than earning it through character. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes tracking every nuance of their interaction, phones appearing at the periphery of her vision as students prepared to document whatever entertainment Blake had planned for his audience. "Thank you," Emma replied simply, her tone polite but not deferential. "I appreciate the welcome, though I've been here for 2 months already." Blake's smile widened at her response, showing perfect teeth that probably cost more than Emma's family spent on healthcare in a year. 2 months, right. Time flies when you're settling into a new environment. I imagine it's quite an adjustment, coming from wherever you came from to a place like Riverside. We have certain traditions here, certain ways of doing things that help maintain the community standards that make our school special. The subtext was clear enough to anyone familiar with Blake's methods. He was establishing parameters for their interaction, defining himself as the arbiter of what belonged at Riverside while positioning Emma as an outsider whose continued presence depended on his approval. It was a masterful opening gambit that simultaneously appeared welcoming while asserting dominance, giving him multiple directions to escalate depending on how she responded. Emma had encountered this type of psychological manipulation before at other schools, though rarely executed with Blake's level of sophistication. The smart response was to accept his implicit authority, demonstrate appropriate gratitude for his attention, and hope that submission would satisfy his need to establish dominance without triggering further harassment. That had been her strategy at 6 previous schools, and it had generally proven effective at avoiding the kind of systematic persecution that could make academic success impossible. But something about Blake Morrison's approach felt different from the typical bullying behavior Emma had learned to navigate. There was a calculated cruelty in his demeanor that suggested he wasn't simply establishing social hierarchy, but actively seeking opportunities to inflict psychological damage for his own entertainment. The way he positioned himself to block her escape routes, the strategic placement of his followers to create an audience, and the timing of his approach during lunch when maximum students would witness their interaction, all indicated someone who had planned this confrontation with military-level precision. "I'm curious about your background," Blake continued, settling into the chair across from Emma without being invited to sit. "Transfer students always have interesting stories. What brought your family to our little corner of Oregon?" The question was designed to elicit information that Blake could use against her, specifically details about her family's financial situation or her father's military deployment that could be weaponized in future harassment campaigns. Emma had dealt with similar fishing expeditions before and had developed standard responses that provided minimal information while appearing cooperative. "My father's work required a relocation," Emma said, taking a sip of her tea while maintaining eye contact with Blake. "We needed to find a school district that could accommodate my academic schedule, and Riverside had the advanced placement programs I needed for my college applications." Blake nodded as if her answer satisfied his curiosity, but Emma caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that indicated disappointment at her failure to provide useful ammunition. Connor Walsh shifted impatiently behind Blake's chair, his massive frame creating a shadow that blocked Emma's view of potential escape routes. Madison Parker examined her perfectly manicured nails with studied boredom, though Emma noticed that her attention remained focused on the interaction with predatory intensity. "College applications, of course," Blake said with enthusiasm that sounded genuine but felt calculated. "It's never too early to start planning your future. What schools are you considering? I imagine the application process can be quite expensive for families who aren't familiar with the requirements. Fortunately, we have excellent guidance counselors here who can help students navigate the complexities of admissions and financial aid." The reference to financial aid was deliberate, designed to mark Emma as someone whose family couldn't afford college tuition without assistance. Blake was building a narrative that would justify whatever harassment campaign he had planned, framing her as someone who was taking opportunities away from more deserving students through need-based assistance, rather than earning her place through genuine merit. Emma recognized the trap and chose her response carefully. "I'm looking at several options based on academic fit rather than cost. My grades and test scores should provide opportunities regardless of my family's financial situation." "Academic merit, absolutely," Blake agreed with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Though I'm sure you've discovered that success at a place like Riverside requires more than just good grades. Social integration, understanding community values, building relationships with the right people. These skills can be just as important as academic achievement when it comes to long-term success." The threat was becoming more explicit now, Blake's language shifting from subtle dominance assertion to direct intimidation. He was making it clear that her academic excellence wouldn't protect her from social persecution if she failed to demonstrate appropriate submission to his authority. Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied recognition of escalating danger, her body automatically shifting into the heightened awareness state that Master Kim had trained her to achieve when facing potential conflict. "I appreciate the advice," Emma said, beginning to pack her lunch materials with deliberate calm. "I should probably head to the Gidea library to prepare for my afternoon classes." "Actually, I was hoping you might join us for a little community building exercise," Blake said, his tone remaining conversational while his body language shifted to prevent her departure. "We have a wonderful environmental education program here at Riverside, and I thought you might be interested in learning about our composting initiative." Connor Walsh moved to block Emma's most direct path toward the main building, while Madison Parker positioned herself to cut off access to the library entrance. Emma realized that Blake had orchestrated this encounter with the same tactical precision her father used when planning military operations, accounting for multiple variables and potential responses while maintaining plausible deniability about his actual intentions. "I'm familiar with composting programs," Emma replied, her voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. "Perhaps another time when I don't have academic commitments." "Oh, but this will only take a moment," Blake insisted, standing up and gesturing toward the school's organic garden area where several large composting bins were located near the science building. "I think you'll find it particularly educational. We've been cultivating some fascinating organisms that play crucial roles in the decomposition process." Emma understood now what Blake had planned for his entertainment. The composting bins contained earthworms and other decomposer organisms that the environmental science classes used for educational purposes. Blake intended to force her into some kind of humiliating interaction with the composting materials, probably while his followers documented her degradation for social media distribution. It was a sophisticated form of harassment that would appear to outside observers like harmless pranking while achieving maximum psychological impact on the target. "I need to decline," Emma said firmly, shouldering her backpack and standing up from the table. "I have studying to do." "I really must insist," Blake said, his mask of friendly authority finally slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "You see, part of being successful at Riverside involves participating in community activities, even when they're outside your comfort zone. Students who isolate themselves and refuse to engage with school traditions sometimes find that their academic performance suffers in unexpected ways." The threat was explicit now. Blake was making it clear that her continued academic success at Riverside depended on her willingness to submit to whatever humiliation he had planned. Emma had reached the decision point that she had hoped to avoid throughout her time at the school. She could either comply with Blake's demands and hope that submission would satisfy his need for dominance, or she could refuse and face whatever escalating harassment campaign he would unleash in response to her defiance. Emma thought about her father, currently preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, where he would face genuinely dangerous enemies who threatened American lives and interests. She thought about her mother, working double shifts at the hospital to support their family while maintaining the strength to care for patients whose lives depended on her expertise and dedication. She thought about Master Kim, who had spent decades building his academy despite facing discrimination and economic hardship, never allowing others to define his worth or limit his potential. "I said no," Emma replied quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made several nearby students stop their conversations and pay attention to the interaction with heightened focus. Blake's expression shifted from predatory amusement to genuine surprise, then quickly to anger, as he realized that his usual tactics were failing to achieve their intended effect. Students at Riverside simply didn't refuse his directives, especially scholarship students who understood how precarious their positions were at the school. Emma's defiance represented a fundamental challenge to the social order that Blake had spent years constructing and maintaining. "I don't think you understand the situation," Blake said, his voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow made it more threatening than if he had shouted. "This isn't a request, Emma. This is how things work here. Students who want to be successful at Riverside learn to participate in community activities when they're invited to do so." Connor Walsh stepped closer to Emma's position, using his size to create physical intimidation while maintaining the pretense that this was simply a friendly conversation about school programs. Madison Parker moved to Emma's other side, her perfectly manicured fingers already holding her phone in position to record whatever humiliation was about to unfold. Emma felt the familiar calm that preceded combat settling over her consciousness like a protective blanket. Master Kim had trained her to recognize this moment, when verbal de-escalation was no longer possible and physical conflict became inevitable. Her breathing slowed and deepened, her muscle tension distributed itself evenly throughout her body, and her peripheral vision expanded to track all potential threats and escape routes simultaneously. "Last chance," Blake said with false regret. "Either you participate willingly in our little educational demonstration, or we'll have to find more creative ways to help you understand Riverside's community values." Emma met Blake's gaze directly and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had never backed down from a genuine threat in her life. "Blake, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I am not going to participate in whatever humiliation you have planned. I am going to walk away from this conversation and continue with my day. If you or your friends attempt to prevent me from leaving, or force me to participate in any activity against my will, you will discover that I am not the helpless scholarship student you think I am." The courtyard had gone completely silent now, with every student in the area focused on the confrontation that was clearly approaching a breaking point. Blake's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he realized that his authority was being challenged publicly in ways that would damage his reputation if he failed to reassert control over the situation. "You know what, Emma?" Blake said with the kind of smile that appeared on predators' faces when they decided to stop playing with their prey. "I think you need a more hands-on lesson about how things work here." Blake gestured to Connor Walsh, who immediately moved to grab Emma's backpack while Madison Parker positioned herself to block any attempt at escape. Emma allowed Connor to take hold of her bag, using his assumption that she would resist to mask her actual preparation for what was about to happen. As Connor pulled on the backpack straps, Emma stepped backward and slightly to the side, creating the angle and distance she would need for her response. "The composting bins are this way," Blake announced loudly enough for his audience to hear clearly. "I think Emma would benefit from a close examination of our decomposer organisms. Maybe she'll develop a better appreciation for Riverside's environmental programs if she gets to interact with them directly." Connor began pulling Emma toward the garden area where the composting bins were located, his grip on her backpack preventing her from simply walking away from the confrontation. Madison Parker followed closely behind, her phone camera recording Emma's apparent helplessness for later social media distribution. Blake walked beside them with theatrical authority, playing his role as the benevolent leader who was simply trying to educate a reluctant student about important school programs. When they reached the composting area, Blake opened one of the large bins to reveal the dark, rich soil that was home to hundreds of earthworms and other decomposer organisms that the environmental science classes studied as part of their curriculum. The smell of decomposing organic matter and moist earth filled the air, creating an unpleasant sensory environment that added to the psychological impact of whatever Blake had planned. "Here we are," Blake announced with false enthusiasm. "This is where Riverside students learn about the crucial role that organisms like earthworms play in breaking down organic matter and creating fertile soil for plant growth. It's really quite fascinating when you get up close and personal with the process." Emma understood now exactly what Blake intended to do. He was going to force her to put her hands into the composting bin, probably requiring her to pick up earthworms or other organisms, while his followers recorded her discomfort and disgust for their entertainment. It was a form of humiliation that would appear relatively harmless to adult observers, while achieving maximum psychological impact on the target, especially if she showed fear or revulsion that could be used against her in future harassment campaigns. Blake reached into the composting bin and withdrew a handful of dark soil containing several large earthworms, holding it out toward Emma with the expectation that she would recoil in disgust. "These little fellows are the real heroes of our ecosystem," he said with exaggerated educational enthusiasm. "They consume organic waste and transform it into nutrient-rich soil that helps plants grow. Don't you think everyone should have a chance to appreciate their important work up close?" Emma looked at the earthworms writhing in Blake's palm and felt something shift inside her consciousness. These creatures were simply doing what nature had designed them to do, breaking down organic matter to create conditions that supported new life. There was nothing inherently disgusting or frightening about earthworms unless someone had been conditioned to view them that way through cultural programming rather than biological understanding. "They're actually quite remarkable," Emma said calmly, extending her own hand to accept the earthworms from Blake's palm. "Earthworms can process their own body weight in organic matter every single day, and their castings contain 5 times more nitrogen than regular soil." Blake's expression shifted from anticipated satisfaction to confusion as Emma showed no signs of disgust or fear at handling the earthworms. His psychological warfare tactics depended on triggering emotional responses that could be exploited for his entertainment, but Emma's genuine interest in the creatures was disrupting his entire scenario. "Well, yes," Blake said, clearly improvising now that his script had been derailed. "But I think you'd benefit from a more immersive educational experience. Maybe you should try tasting some of our compost to really understand the complete life cycle of organic decomposition." The suggestion crossed the line from harassment into assault, and Emma realized that Blake's frustration at her failure to react with appropriate fear was driving him to escalate beyond his original plan. Connor Walsh tightened his grip on her backpack straps, preparing to force her compliance with Blake's increasingly desperate attempts to establish dominance through humiliation. "That's not going to happen," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying a quality that made Connor instinctively loosen his grip on her bag. "I think it is," Blake replied, reaching into the composting bin to withdraw another handful of soil, this time containing not just earthworms but partially decomposed organic matter that would be genuinely unpleasant to consume. "You see, Emma, students who refuse to participate in Riverside's educational programs sometimes need extra encouragement to develop proper school spirit." Blake moved the handful of compost toward Emma's face with clear intention to force her to eat the mixture of soil and earthworms, while Connor Walsh repositioned himself to prevent her from escaping the assault. Madison Parker angled her phone camera to capture the moment of ultimate humiliation that would destroy Emma's reputation at Riverside and serve as a warning to other students about the consequences of challenging Blake's authority. Emma allowed Blake to bring the compost within inches of her face before she acted, her response so swift and precise that most observers would later struggle to describe exactly what had happened. Her left hand shot upward in a perfect rising block that intercepted Blake's wrist, while simultaneously her right hand grabbed his forearm and used his forward momentum to unbalance him completely. The handful of compost scattered harmlessly as Blake stumbled backward, his feet tangling together as he tried to regain his balance. But Emma wasn't finished with her response. As Blake windmilled his arms in a desperate attempt to stay upright, Emma pivoted on her left foot and chambered her right leg in preparation for the technique that Master Kim had spent 3 years helping her perfect. Her spinning heel kick launched with the kind of explosive power that could only be generated through perfect biomechanics and years of disciplined training. The kick was a work of art in its technical execution. Emma's rotation generated momentum through her entire body, from her supporting leg, through her core muscles, to the heel that became the focal point for all that kinetic energy. She had practiced this technique thousands of times on heavy bags and focus mitts, but never before on a human target who deserved every ounce of force she was capable of delivering. Blake Morrison never saw the kick coming. His attention was focused on trying to regain his balance after Emma's initial defensive movement, and by the time his brain registered the spinning motion in his peripheral vision, it was far too late to attempt any kind of protective response. Emma's heel connected with Blake's solar plexus with devastating precision, the impact driving every molecule of air from his lungs while sending shockwaves through his entire nervous system. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Blake doubled over as if he had been struck by a sledgehammer, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as his respiratory system struggled to remember how to function. He tried to inhale but could only produce a horrible wheezing sound as his diaphragm spasmed from the impact. His legs gave out completely, dropping him to his knees in the carefully manicured grass beside the composting bins. Then Blake Morrison, the student body president and captain of the lacrosse team who had terrorized Riverside Preparatory for 4 years, began to vomit with the kind of violence that suggested his body was trying to expel every meal he had consumed in the past week. The retching sounds echoed across the courtyard as his breakfast and lunch painted the ground in front of him in wet, chunky streams that sent nearby students scrambling backward to avoid the splatter. Connor Walsh stood frozen in shock, his brain struggling to process what had just happened to his supposedly invincible leader. The scholarship girl who was supposed to be helpless had just disabled Blake Morrison with a single kick that looked like something from a martial arts movie. Connor's athletic experience was limited to overpowering smaller opponents through size and aggression, and he had no framework for understanding how someone half his weight had just destroyed the most powerful student at Riverside. Madison Parker had stopped recording, her phone hanging forgotten in her hand as she stared at Blake's continuing gastric distress with a mixture of horror and fascination. The perfect Instagram moment she had been expecting to capture had turned into something that would require significant editing to avoid violating the platform's policies regarding graphic content. Emma stood calmly beside the composting bins, her breathing slightly elevated from the physical exertion but otherwise showing no signs of stress or emotional disturbance. She brushed a few pieces of scattered compost from her school uniform and adjusted her backpack straps while Blake continued to empty his stomach onto the ground with diminishing intensity. The silence that followed Blake's final retching sound was so complete that Emma could hear the distant traffic on the Columbia River Bridge and the whispered conversations of students who were too far away to have witnessed the actual confrontation, but close enough to see its aftermath. Dozens of phones were recording now, capturing Blake Morrison's humiliation for posterity and social media distribution in ways that would make Emma's previous viral moment seem insignificant by comparison. "Are you finished?" Emma asked Blake, her tone carrying the same polite interest she might use when asking about someone's weekend plans. Blake tried to respond but could only produce another weak retching sound as his body continued to reject the physical trauma Emma's kick had inflicted. He remained on his hands and knees, strings of saliva connecting his mouth to the puddle of vomit beneath him while he struggled to regain enough composure to speak. Emma turned her attention to Connor Walsh, who had unconsciously taken several steps backward when she focused on him. "Connor, I believe Blake was trying to force me to eat earthworms and compost as some kind of educational experience. Did you understand that he was planning to assault me?" Connor's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as he realized that Emma was creating an official record of what had transpired, one that would be supported by dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings. Blake's actions had crossed legal lines that could result in criminal charges, especially given the clear evidence of premeditation and the involvement of multiple participants. We were just... It was supposed to be," Connor stammered, his limited vocabulary proving inadequate for the situation he found himself trying to explain. "You were assisting Blake in planning to force me to consume organic matter against my will," Emma continued with clinical precision. "That constitutes assault, and your physical restraint of my movement makes you an accessory to the crime. I assume you understand the legal implications of those actions." Madison Parker finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than her usual confident tone. "It was just supposed to be a prank. Nobody was actually going to make you eat anything." Emma looked at Madison with the kind of expression a scientist might use when examining an interesting but ultimately insignificant specimen. "Madison, I have approximately 40 witnesses and at least a dozen video recordings that document Blake's clear intention to force compost into my mouth while Connor physically restrained me. Your phone captured most of it before you stopped recording in shock. I don't think it was just a prank is going to serve as an effective legal defense. Blake finally managed to lift his head from the ground, though his face remained an unhealthy shade of green and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. When he tried to speak, his voice was barely above a whisper and carried none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier threats. You can't. My family. Blake wheezed, unable to complete coherent sentences through the pain radiating from his solar plexus and the nausea that continued to roll through his digestive system in waves. Your family's wealth and political connections won't protect you from the consequences of attempted assault, Emma replied matter-of-factly. Especially when the evidence is this comprehensive and the witnesses include students from families that are equally prominent in the community. I imagine several of these recordings will be forwarded to law enforcement within the hour. Emma was correct in her assessment. Among the students who had witnessed Blake's humiliation were the children of district attorneys, federal judges, and business leaders who competed directly with Morrison Tech Solutions for government contracts. Blake's assumption that his family's influence would shield him from consequences had always been based on the cooperation of victims who were too intimidated or isolated to fight back effectively. Emma represented something he had never encountered. Someone with the skills to defend herself and the intelligence to ensure that his actions would be documented thoroughly enough to overcome any attempts at cover-up or retaliation. Dr. Patricia Williams, Riverside's principal, arrived at the scene with campus security in tow, her expression reflecting the kind of professional concern that accompanied incidents requiring immediate damage control. Dr. Williams had spent 15 years managing elite private schools, and she possessed the political instincts necessary to navigate situations where wealthy families' reputations collided with legal liabilities and public relations disasters. What happened here? Dr. Williams asked, though her tone suggested she already understood the basic parameters of the situation from the reports that had reached her office within minutes of Blake's spectacular defeat. Emma straightened her shoulders and addressed the principal with the respectful confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear from official scrutiny. Dr. Williams, Blake Morrison and his friends attempted to force me to consume earthworms and compost as part of what they claimed was an educational exercise about Riverside's environmental programs. When I declined to participate, they used physical restraint to prevent me from leaving and attempted to force organic matter into my mouth against my will. I defended myself using appropriate force to prevent the assault from continuing. Dr. Williams looked down at Blake, who was still on his hands and knees beside a puddle of his own vomit, then at Connor Walsh and Madison Parker, whose guilty expressions confirmed Emma's account of the incident. The principal's mental calculations were visible on her face as she considered the legal, financial, and public relations implications of a situation that could destroy Riverside's reputation if handled incorrectly. "Blake, do you require medical attention?" Dr. Williams asked, her tone suggesting that she hoped the answer would be negative to avoid additional complications. I think I'm okay," Blake managed to say, though his voice remained weak and his color hadn't returned to normal. The truth was that Emma's kick had been delivered with enough precision to cause maximum pain and disorientation without inflicting permanent injury, a testament to her training and her understanding of human anatomy. "Connor, Madison, please escort Blake to the nurse's office for evaluation," Dr. Williams instructed. "Emma, I need to speak with you privately about this incident." As Blake's supporters helped him to his feet and guided him toward the main building, Emma could see the fundamental shift in power dynamics that her response had created. Students who had spent years deferring to Blake's authority now watched him stumble away while supported by his friends, his invincibility permanently shattered by a quiet scholarship student who had proven that real power came from within rather than from external advantages. The crowd of witnesses began to disperse slowly, their conversations animated with excited speculation about what the incident would mean for Riverside's social hierarchy. Emma had become legendary in the space of 60 seconds, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that systematic bullying could be stopped by someone with the courage to fight back and the skills to win decisively. Dr. Williams gestured for Emma to follow her toward the administrative building, her expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Emma, I want you to know that Riverside Preparatory does not tolerate harassment or assault of any kind. Your defensive actions appear to have been appropriate given the circumstances. but I need to understand exactly what led to this confrontation. Emma provided a detailed account of Blake's escalating harassment campaign, from his initial attempts to establish dominance through his systematic targeting of her family, and culminating in the attempted assault that had triggered her physical response. She spoke with the clinical precision of someone reporting to a military superior, providing facts without emotional coloring or personal opinions about Blake's motivations. "I see," Dr. Williams said when Emma finished her account. "Emma, are you aware that your defensive technique could have caused serious injury to Blake if you had struck him slightly differently?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma replied without hesitation. "I've been training in taekwondo for 10 years under Master Kim Sung-ho's instruction. I understand human anatomy and the effects of various striking techniques on different parts of the body. My response was calibrated to disable Blake's ability to continue his assault without causing permanent damage." Dr. Williams nodded slowly, processing the implications of having a student with genuine martial arts expertise on campus. "Emma, given your background in training, do you understand why some people might view your response as excessive force, regardless of the provocation?" Emma met the principal's gaze directly and spoke with the quiet confidence that came from absolute certainty about the righteousness of her actions. "Dr. Williams, Blake Morrison attempted to physically force organic matter into my mouth while his friends restrained me from escaping. That constitutes sexual assault under Oregon state law, and I was legally justified in using whatever force was necessary to prevent the crime from continuing. My training allowed me to end the assault quickly and definitively without causing the kind of damage that would have resulted from a less controlled response." The principal's expression shifted as she realized that Emma possessed not only the physical skills to defend herself, but also the legal knowledge to frame her actions within appropriate statutory frameworks. This wasn't a typical teenage altercation that could be resolved through detention and parental conferences. This was a situation involving potential criminal charges and civil liability that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. "I understand your position," Dr. Williams said carefully. "However, I hope you also understand that Riverside has a responsibility to maintain a safe learning environment for all students. Violence, even in self-defense, creates concerns about escalation and retaliation that we must address proactively." Emma nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the political complexities that Dr. Williams faced in managing an incident involving the son of one of Riverside's most important benefactors. "I have no interest in continuing any conflict with Blake or his friends. My goal is to complete my education here without further harassment and move on to college with the kind of academic record that will provide opportunities for my future. I hope that Blake has learned enough from today's experience to avoid creating situations that might require similar responses." Dr. Williams smiled slightly at Emma's diplomatic phrasing, which managed to sound conciliatory while making it clear that further harassment would be met with equally decisive countermeasures. "I believe we can arrange for all parties to move forward constructively. Emma, I want to thank you for handling this situation with such maturity and restraint. Your academic record at Riverside has been exemplary, and I hope that continues to be the case." As Emma left the administrative building and walked toward her afternoon classes, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes tracking her movement through the hallways. The story of her confrontation with Blake Morrison was spreading through Riverside's social networks with the speed of digital communication, transforming her from invisible scholarship student to legendary figure in the space of a single lunch period. Students who had previously ignored her completely now stepped aside as she passed, their expressions mixing respect with something approaching fear. Emma understood that her demonstration of martial arts expertise had fundamentally altered how others perceived her, creating both opportunities and challenges that she would need to navigate carefully. Sophie Martinez appeared at Emma's locker as she gathered his materials for her afternoon classes, her face reflecting a mixture of awe and concern that had become common among students who witnessed the incident. "Emma, are you okay? I've never seen anything like that before." "I'm fine," Emma replied calmly, organizing her textbooks with the same methodical precision she brought to all her activities. "Blake created a situation that required a defensive response, and I provided one. Hopefully he'll make better choices in the future." "Jake said Blake couldn't stop throwing up for like 15 minutes, Sophie continued with obvious fascination. "He said it looked like you hit him with a baseball bat or something. Where did you learn to do that?" Emma closed her locker and shouldered her backpack before answering Sophie's question. "My father believed that everyone should know how to defend themselves and protect others who might not be able to protect themselves. The techniques I use today are the result of 10 years of training and discipline. Sophie nodded as if Emma's explanation made perfect sense, though her expression suggested she was still processing the implications of having someone with genuine fighting skills among her classmates. Do you think Blake will try to get revenge or something? His family has a lot of influence in this town. Emma considered Sophie's question while they walked toward their shared advanced placement literature class. Blake Morrison has learned an important lesson today about the difference between social power and actual power. If he's intelligent, he'll apply that lesson to avoid creating situations where he might need to learn additional lessons of a similar nature. The remainder of Emma's school day passed in a surreal atmosphere, where normal academic activities continued, alongside constant speculation about the morning's incident and its implications for Riverside's social hierarchy. Teachers who had previously treated Emma as simply another scholarship student now showed heightened interest in her academic performance and participation in class discussions. Her advanced placement literature teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, seemed particularly thoughtful as she observed Emma's analysis of the power dynamics in Shakespeare's plays, nodding approvingly at insights that connected classical themes to contemporary situations involving the abuse of authority and the consequences of challenging established hierarchies. During her final class of the day, Advanced Placement Chemistry, Emma noticed that even the most privileged students were treating her with unprecedented respect and deference. Blake's absence from class created a palpable void in the social atmosphere, with students unconsciously adjusting their behavior to account for the absence of the dominant personality who had shaped their interactions for 4 years. As the final bell rang and students began gathering their materials for departure, Emma reflected on how completely her situation at Riverside had changed in the space of a single confrontation. She had arrived at the school hoping to remain invisible until graduation, but Blake Morrison's harassment campaign had forced her to reveal capabilities that made invisibility impossible. The bus ride home provided Emma with time to process the day's events and consider their implications for her remaining time at Riverside. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications from social media platforms where videos of her confrontation with Blake were being shared and commented upon by thousands of viewers. The spinning heel kick that had ended Blake's harassment campaign was being analyzed frame by martial arts enthusiasts who marveled at her technique and precision. Emma arrived at Master Kim's academy to find her instructor waiting in the main training area with an expression that mixed pride with concern. News of the incident had reached him through the community networks that connected local business owners, and he had spent the afternoon fielding phone calls from parents who wanted to know more about the quiet girl who had demonstrated such devastating martial arts skills at Riverside Preparatory. "Show me exactly what happened," Master Kim said without preamble, gesturing toward the practice mats where Emma had spent countless hours perfecting the techniques she had used to defend herself. Emma changed into her training clothes and demonstrated the sequence of movements she had used to counter Blake's assault, from the initial defensive block through the spinning heel kick that had ended the confrontation. Master Kim observed with the critical eye of someone who had taught these techniques and understood their potential for causing serious injury when applied with full force. "Your technique was perfect," Master Kim said when Emma finished her demonstration. "Your control was excellent, delivering exactly the amount of force necessary to end the threat without causing permanent damage. Your father would be proud of how you applied your training to protect yourself." Emma bowed respectfully to her instructor, understanding that his approval represented validation of not just her technical skills but also her judgment in applying those skills appropriately. "Master Kim, I tried to avoid this confrontation for 2 months. Blake Morrison made it impossible to continue avoiding him without sacrificing my dignity and safety." "You made the correct choice," Master Kim replied firmly. "A martial artist's first responsibility is to avoid unnecessary conflict. But when conflict becomes unavoidable, the response must be swift, decisive, and proportional to the threat. You demonstrated all of these principles today." Emma spent the remainder of her training session working through forms and combinations that helped her process the adrenaline and emotional residue from the day's confrontation. The familiar movements centered her mind and reminded her that martial arts training was about much more than fighting. It was about developing the kind of inner strength and discipline that allowed someone to remain calm under pressure and make correct decisions when others would panic. As evenings settled over Riverside, Emma's mother arrived home from her shift at the hospital with news that the incident at Riverside Preparatory had become a topic of conversation among the medical staff. Dr. Sarah Chen had fielded several inquiries from colleagues whose children attended the school, all wanting to know more about the scholarship student who had defended herself so effectively against the Morrison family's son. The head of emergency medicine mentioned that Blake Morrison was brought in for evaluation after your confrontation, Dr. Chen said as she and Emma prepared dinner together in their small apartment kitchen. Apparently he was concerned about internal injuries from the kick you delivered, though the examination showed no serious damage. Emma nodded, unsurprised that Blake's family would seek medical attention after the kind of impact she had delivered to his solar plexus. My technique was designed to cause maximum pain and disorientation without permanent injury. Master Kim taught me to understand the difference between defending myself and seriously harming someone. Dr. Chen smiled with the kind of pride that came from watching her daughter apply years of training and discipline to protect herself from genuine danger. Your father called this afternoon after hearing about the incident through his military contacts. He wanted me to tell you that he's proud of how you handled yourself, and that you demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment he hoped you would develop through your martial arts training. The evening news featured a brief segment about the incident at Riverside Preparatory, focusing on the broader issues of bullying at elite private schools rather than the specific details of Emma's confrontation with Blake Morrison. The reporter mentioned that video of the incident had gone viral on social media platforms, with many viewers praising the unnamed student who had defended herself against harassment by multiple attackers. Emma watched the news coverage with detached interest, understanding that her actions had resonated with people who had faced their own versions of Blake Morrison throughout their lives. The spinning heel kick that had ended his harassment campaign had become a symbol of effective resistance against bullying behavior, inspiring others who had felt powerless against systematic persecution. As she prepared for bed, Emma reflected on how completely her life had changed in the space of a single day. She had arrived at Riverside Preparatory, hoping to complete her education quietly and move on to college without drawing attention to herself or her family's circumstances. Blake Morrison's harassment campaign had made that strategy impossible, forcing her to reveal capabilities that would define her reputation at the school for the remainder of her time there. But Emma felt no regret about her actions or their consequences. Blake Morrison had chosen to escalate their conflict into territory that required a physical response, and she had provided exactly the kind of decisive countermeasure that would prevent future harassment of herself or other students he might target. The lesson he had learned about the difference between social power and actual power would serve him well if he was intelligent enough to apply it to his future interactions with others. The following morning brought news that would reshape Riverside Preparatory's social landscape permanently. Blake Morrison had been withdrawn from the school by his parents, who announced that he would be completing his senior year at a private boarding facility in Montana that specialized in character development for troubled young men from prominent families. Connor Walsh and Madison Parker faced suspension pending investigation of their roles in the attempted assault, with the possibility of expulsion if the evidence supported criminal charges. Emma arrived at school to find her locker decorated with small offerings from students who wanted to show their appreciation for her courage in standing up to Blake's harassment campaign. Notes of thanks, small gifts, and expressions of solidarity had been left by classmates who had suffered under Blake's psychological warfare tactics but had never possessed the resources or skills to fight back effectively. Dr. Williams made a school-wide announcement during morning assembly, emphasizing Riverside's commitment to maintaining a safe learning environment free from harassment and intimidation. While she didn't mention Emma by name, everyone understood that the scholarship student who had defended herself so effectively had permanently altered the social dynamics that had characterized the school for years. Emma Chen had transformed from invisible outsider to legendary figure in the space of 60 seconds, proving that genuine strength came from within rather than from external advantages like wealth or social connections. Her spinning heel kick had ended Blake Morrison's reign of terror at Riverside Preparatory, but more importantly, it had demonstrated to an entire school community that systematic bullying could be stopped by someone with the courage to fight back and the skills to win decisively. The story of Emma's confrontation with Blake would be told and retold among Riverside students for years to come, serving as both inspiration for potential victims of harassment and warning for would-be bullies who might consider using their privilege to torment others. Emma had never wanted to become a symbol of resistance against injustice. But her actions had created exactly that kind of legacy, proving that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who simply refused to be broken, by those who thought power meant the ability to hurt others without consequences. As Emma settled into her new reality as Riverside's most respected and feared student, she understood that her demonstration of martial arts expertise had created both opportunities and responsibilities that would extend far beyond her time at the school. Other students would look to her for protection and guidance, while potential bullies would test themselves against her reputation to see if they could succeed where Blake Morrison had failed so spectacularly. But Emma Chen was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Armed with 10 years of martial arts training, the support of a loving family, and the knowledge that she possessed the skills and judgment necessary to protect herself and others from anyone who might mistake privilege for power or wealth for strength. Her spinning heel kick had done more than end Blake Morrison's harassment campaign. It had announced to the world that some people would never be victims, no matter what advantages their oppressors might possess. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.